There is a question that sits at the heart of some of the most disturbing cases in modern history. A question that search teams, forensic investigators, and law enforcement professionals have spent years trying to answer, and have never been able to. Not fully. Not in a way that makes sense. The question is simple. Where did they go? Not how did they die. Not who took them. Not what happened in their final moments. Just, where did they go? Because in the cases I am going to tell you about tonight, that most basic question has never been answered. In October of 1999, a group of adults stood on a hiking trail in the mountains of Colorado and watched a 3-year-old boy run ahead of them. They called his name. He didn't answer. They walked faster, expecting to find him around the next bend. He wasn't there. They ran. He wasn't anywhere. Within the hour, over 1,000 people were searching those mountains. Search dogs, helicopters, professional trackers. They found nothing. No footprints beyond the last point he was seen. No clothing. No disturbance in the leaves. No sign that a child had ever been on that trail at all. 4 years later, his remains appeared in a location that those search teams had walked through dozens of times. Nobody has ever explained how they got there. His name was Jaryd Atadero, and his case is just the beginning of what I need to tell you tonight. To understand what happened to Jaryd Atadero, you need to understand the place. Poudre Canyon is a stretch of wilderness in northern Colorado. It sits inside the Roosevelt National Forest at elevations that reach above 10,000 feet in some areas. And it is the kind of terrain where a wrong turn can take you miles from safety before you realize it. But on the morning of October 2nd, 1999, it was also breathtakingly beautiful. The aspens were turning gold. The air was cold and clean. The kind of autumn morning that makes you feel like nothing bad could ever happen. Alan Atadero had brought his 3-year-old son Jared along on a group hike with his church singles group. There were roughly 12 adults in the party, experienced hikers, people who knew the area. Jared was small even for his age. Blonde hair, blue eyes, full of the kind of energy that only 3-year-olds have. He loved being outside. He had been on hikes before. He was excited. The group set out on the Big South Trail, following the Cache-la Poudre River into the canyon. It was, by every account, a perfect morning. At some point during the hike, the group stopped to rest near a fishing area along the river. Jared, the way 3-year-olds do, didn't want to rest. He had spotted something ahead on the trail, or heard something, or simply felt the pull that young children sometimes feel toward whatever is just out of sight. He ran ahead. The adults assumed he was fine. Children do this on hikes. They run a little ahead and then stop and wait. They round a bend and then come running back. Nobody was alarmed. Not at first. The adults finished resting and started walking again. They expected to find Jared just ahead. He wasn't there. They called his name. Nothing. They walked faster. They called louder. Still nothing. Within 15 minutes, Alan Atadero knew something was wrong. Not just the normal kind of wrong where a child wanders slightly off path. Something deeper. Something that fathers sometimes feel before they can explain it. He ran. He called Jared's name until his voice broke. The canyon did not answer. By nightfall on October 2nd, the search for Jaryd Atadero had become one of the largest missing child operations in the history of Colorado. More than 1,000 volunteers showed up within the first 24 hours. The Larimer County Sheriff's Office coordinated the ground search. The Colorado Division of Wildlife assisted. Professional tracking teams were brought in from across the state. Search dogs were deployed along every trail in the area. Helicopters swept the canyon from above. The river was searched. Every tributary, every sandbar where a small body could have come to rest. Volunteers walked in lines through the undergrowth, checking behind every rock and tree and fallen log. They searched through the night. They searched the next day, and the day after that. What they found was nothing. Not a single footprint beyond the last known location where the group had seen Jaryd running ahead. No broken branches at child height. No disturbed soil. The search dogs, which are trained to track even days-old scent in difficult terrain, lost all trace of Jaryd at a specific point on the trail. They could not pick it up again. The lead investigators on the case noted this in their reports. The way the scent simply stopped, without explanation, at a particular spot on the path, as if the trail didn't just go cold, as if it had been cut. The official search was eventually scaled back. Volunteers were released. The professional teams withdrew. Jaryd Atadero was listed as a missing child. His father refused to accept that his son was simply gone. He kept searching. He drove to the canyon on weekends. He walked the trails. He called Jaryd's name into forests that gave nothing back. For 4 years, there was nothing. And then, in a way that nobody was prepared for, something came back. June 4th, 2003. Nearly 4 years after Jaryd Atadero vanished, a group of hikers were moving through the Cache La Poudre wilderness at high elevation, well above the main trail system, in terrain that required scrambling over boulders and navigating steep, rocky switchbacks. They found skeletal remains on an open slope. Small remains, the kind that belonged to a child. Investigators were called. DNA testing was conducted. The results confirmed what Alan Atadero had spent 4 years dreading and 4 years hoping would never be true. The remains belonged to Jaryd. And now began the part of this case that investigators, forensic experts, and experienced search professionals have never been able to explain. The slope where Jaryd's remains were found was above the original search area. Not just slightly above, significantly above. At an elevation that presented a serious challenge even for fit adult hikers. The terrain between the main trail and that slope included boulder fields, steep rock faces, and dense undergrowth. There was no path. There was no route that a 3-year-old child could have walked, crawled, or stumbled through and arrived at that location in any amount of time. But that isn't the most disturbing part. That slope had been searched. Not once, not twice. Search teams had physically covered that area multiple times in the weeks following Jaryd's disappearance. The remains were not hidden. They were not buried. They were not concealed in any way. They were in open terrain, visible from multiple angles. There is no explanation for why they were not found during the original search. There is no explanation for how a 3-year-old child reached that elevation. The forensic examination of the remains found evidence of damage to the skull consistent with a strike from a large animal, possibly a mountain lion, possibly a large raptor such as a golden eagle. But no large predator native to that region could have transported remains to that location and left them arranged in the way they were found. The medical examiner completed the report. Under cause of death, they wrote one word: undetermined. Alan Atadero wrote a book about his son. He called it I Have Your Son. He wrote about the search, about the 4 years of silence, about the discovery that answered nothing and only deepened the mystery. He wrote about what it means to lose a child and never understand how. He has spoken publicly about his belief that what happened to Jaryd on that trail was not something that can be explained by conventional means. Whether you share that belief or not, the facts of the case are on record. A 3-year-old boy vanished from a heavily searched trail. His remains appeared 4 years later in an impossible location. The cause of his death was never determined, and nobody, in the 26 years since that October morning in Poudre Canyon, has ever explained where Jaryd Atadero went. Jared Atadero's case would be disturbing enough if it stood alone, but it doesn't stand alone. In 2012, a former law enforcement officer and investigator named David Paulides published a book called Missing 411. The book was the result of years of painstaking research into missing persons cases across national parks and wilderness areas throughout North America. Paulides had not set out to find a pattern. He had originally been investigating a single case when a park ranger mentioned, almost in passing, that unusual disappearances in national parks were more common than the public was aware of. That offhand comment sent him down a research path that took years to complete. What he found when he reached the end of it was deeply unsettling. Paulides documented hundreds of cases of people who had vanished in national parks and wilderness areas under circumstances that defied conventional explanation. Not because they had been murdered, not because they had been the victims of obvious accidents, but because the details of their disappearances shared specific, recurring characteristics that should not have been possible. Characteristics that appeared again and again across completely separate cases, in completely separate locations, across completely separate decades. He did not offer an explanation for the pattern. He simply presented the data, and the data was impossible to ignore. Let me walk you through what Paulides found. The first characteristic is the distance problem. Victims are frequently recovered miles from the point of their disappearance, not just a few hundred meters off trail. Miles, in terrain that would have been physically impossible for them to cover in the time they were missing. Elderly people found at high elevation. Young children found in areas requiring technical climbing. People with physical disabilities found in locations that experienced hikers would struggle to reach. The distance and terrain are, in case after case, simply not compatible with the victim getting there on their own. The second characteristic is what happens to the scent. Search dogs trained to track human scent are among the most reliable tools in wilderness search and rescue operations. Under normal circumstances, a trained dog can follow a trail that is days old through rain, mud, and difficult terrain. In the cases Paulides documented, the dogs consistently lose the scent at a specific point, not gradually, not because of rain or crossing water, at a particular spot. The scent simply stops. The dogs sit down. They turn in circles. They cannot pick it up again, and that spot is frequently at the edge of a body of water, even when there is no evidence that the victim entered the water. The third characteristic is the one that connects directly back to Jaryd Atadero. Victims are regularly found in areas that have already been thoroughly searched, not in hidden locations, not buried or concealed, in plain sight, in open terrain, in areas that professional search teams have physically walked through. There is no explanation in the case files for why they were not found during the original search. They simply were not there, and then they were. The fourth characteristic involves the weather. In case after case, unusual weather events occur in the immediate aftermath of a disappearance. Sudden storms, dense fog, extreme cold descending without warning, weather conditions that hamper search operations and force teams to withdraw. The frequency with which this occurs across completely unconnected cases, in completely different regions, over completely different decades, is statistically unusual. And the fifth characteristic is perhaps the strangest of all. Victims are frequently found without their shoes. Not one shoe missing. Both shoes gone. In wilderness terrain. In conditions where removing your shoes would make survival significantly harder. Miles from where they were last seen. No shoes. No explanation. The cases in the missing 411 research spanned decades and locations across North America. Dennis Martin, 6 years old, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, June 1969. He vanished during a family hike in seconds. A witness said he simply stepped behind a bush to surprise his family and never came out the other side. What followed was one of the largest search operations in American history at that time. Green Berets were deployed. Thousands of civilian volunteers. The full resources of the National Park Service. Dennis Martin was never found, not a trace. Stacy Aris, 14 years old, Yosemite National Park, July 1981. She was at a family camp and walked a short distance to photograph a lake. An adult witness watched her walk the entire way. She reached the lake. She stepped behind a rock. She never came out the other side. The witness was watching the entire time. The rock was small. There was nowhere to go. Stacy Aris was never found. The National Park Service does not maintain a centralized database of missing persons cases across the park system. Each park handles its own records independently. David Paulides has noted repeatedly that when he attempted to obtain missing persons data from national parks through Freedom of Information requests, he encountered significant difficulty and in many cases was asked to pay fees that would have made comprehensive research prohibitively expensive. The parks have declined to publicly address his research. What is taking people from these places? Has no official answer. There is a mountain in southwestern Vermont that the native Abenaki people refused to settle near. Not because it was inhospitable. Not because of practical concerns about terrain or weather. Because they believed the mountain was wrong. The Abenaki described it as a place where the four winds converged. A crossing point. A location where the boundary between the ordinary world and something else was thinner than it should be. They called it a place that took things. They were not wrong. Glastonbury Mountain sits at the heart of what researchers and locals now call the Bennington Triangle, a zone of Vermont wilderness that, between 1945 and 1950, claimed 5 human lives. 5 people. 5 years. Not a single one of them ever recovered. The writer Joseph Citro was the first to formally document the pattern and give it a name. He was deliberate in choosing the term Bennington Triangle, not because he believed the comparison to Bermuda was literal, but because the clustering of unexplained disappearances within such a defined geographical area over such a concentrated period of time warranted a name that reflected its seriousness. In 5 years, 5 people walked into the wilderness around Glastonbury Mountain. None of them walked back out. And the circumstances of each disappearance carry the same impossible quality that runs through everything I have told you tonight. The first was Midday Rivers, 74 years old, a local man who had lived and hunted in these mountains his entire life. November 12, 1945. Rivers was acting as a guide for a group of 4 hunters. He knew this terrain the way most people know their own neighborhoods. He had walked every trail in this area hundreds of times over decades. On that November afternoon, he moved ahead of the group to scout the trail. The hunters followed behind at a short distance. When they reached the point where they expected to find him waiting, he wasn't there. Midday Rivers, a man who knew those mountains better than almost anyone, was gone. He was never seen again. The second was Paula Weldon, 18 years old, a sophomore at Bennington College. December 1st, 1946. She set out alone to hike the long trail. An older couple, Ernest and Martha Whitman, were hiking the same trail that day. They noticed Paula ahead of them, a young woman in a bright red parka, moving at a quick pace. The Whitmans walked faster, concerned about a young woman hiking alone as daylight faded. They kept her in sight the entire time. The trail ahead was straight and clearly visible. They watched Paula reach a bend in the path and walk around it. They were close behind her, perhaps 30 seconds. They rounded the same bend. Paula Weldon was gone. The trail continued straight ahead for a long distance, clearly visible. There was nowhere she could have gone. There were no footprints in the snow beyond the bend. Paula Weldon was never found. James Tetford, December 1st, 1949. Tetford was a veteran living in the Soldiers' Home in Bennington. On that date, he boarded a bus in St. Albans, Vermont, heading home. 14 other passengers were on that bus. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing him seated in his usual spot during the journey. The bus made several stops. It continued toward Bennington. When it arrived at the final stop, the seat where James Tetford had been sitting was empty. His luggage was still on the rack above. His belongings were still in the seat pocket. He had not disembarked at any of the scheduled stops. Nobody saw him leave. James Tetford was never seen again. 8-year-old Paul Jepson, October 12, 1950. His mother had brought him along while she did work at a local pig farm. At some point during the afternoon, she turned her attention away from him briefly. When she looked back, he was gone. Search dogs were deployed immediately. The dogs picked up Paul's scent trail and followed it with confidence for some distance. The trail led toward the mountains, toward Glastonbury, and then, at a specific point on the road at the edge of the wilderness area, the scent stopped. The dogs sat down and would not continue. Paul Jepson's scent trail ended at the exact boundary where the wilderness began. He was never found. The fifth was Frida Langer, October 28, 1950. She was an experienced hiker, familiar with the Glastonbury mountain area. She was hiking with her cousin Herbert Elsner when she slipped crossing a stream and fell into the water. She told Herbert she would return to their nearby camp to change her wet clothes and would rejoin him shortly. The camp was close. The route back was straightforward. She never arrived. 7 months later, in May 1951, Frida Langer's body was found in an open area near Somerset Reservoir, an area that search teams had covered multiple times. She had not been there before. Now she was. The medical examiner examined her remains. Cause of death was listed as undetermined. 5 people, 5 years, 1 mountain. The only remains ever recovered were Frida Langer's, 7 months after she vanished, in a location that had been searched multiple times. No cause of death. No explanation. No evidence of foul play. The other 4 were never found. No bodies. No clothing. No evidence of what happened to them. Midday Rivers, who knew those mountains better than almost anyone, gone in an instant on a trail he had walked hundreds of times. Paula Weldon, vanishing in plain sight around a bend in the snow, witnessed by 2 people who were 30 seconds behind her. James Tetford, disappearing from a moving bus surrounded by 14 witnesses. Paul Jepson, whose scent trail simply ended at the tree line as if he had stepped off the edge of the world. Glastonbury Mountain is still there. The trails are still open. People still hike them every year. The 4 winds still meet at the summit. And whatever took 5 people from this mountain between 1945 and 1950 has never been identified, has never been named, has never been explained. Jaryd Atadero. The missing 411 cases. The Bennington Triangle. 3 stories. 3 locations. 3 different eras. And the same impossible question running through all of them like a thread you cannot cut. Where did they go? I don't have an answer for you. Nobody does. The investigators who work these cases don't have one. The search teams don't have one. The forensic experts who examined what little evidence existed don't have one. The official files on most of these cases remain open, not because there are active leads, not because investigators expect new evidence to emerge, but because the cases were never closed, because the question was never answered. That is the most frightening thing about these cases. Not the details, not the impossible distances or the scent trails that end without reason or the remains that appear in places they could not have reached. The most frightening thing is the silence. The silence where an explanation should be. If this video stayed with you, subscribe to Night Trace. There are more cases like these, and some of them are much closer to home than you might think.